Hi, this is Patrick Conroy, and this is Chapter 2, the Constitution. Now, I've broken this lecture into three parts, just so you know one part is too long, and it's very manageable for you to just sit and watch. Okay, the Constitution. Learning objectives for this chapter. Describe the ideas behind the American Revolution and their role in shaping the Constitution. Analyze how the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation led to its failure. Describe the delegates to the Constitutional Convention and the core ideas they shared. Categorize the issues at the Constitutional Convention and outline the resolutions reached on each type of issue. Analyze how the components of the Madisonian system address the dilemma of reconciling majority rule with the protection of minority interests. Compare and contrast the Federalists and Anti-Federalists in terms of their backgrounds and their positions regarding government. Explain how the Constitution can be formally amended and how it changes informally. Assess whether the Constitution establishes a majority democracy and how it limits the scope of government. As I said, now you can see why I break it up into three parts. Okay, the origins of the Constitution. It didn't just pop out of nowhere. These were people who believed in certain things that were based on their history, their heritage, the philosophers of the times, and the things that they were reading. So we're going to go over these one by one. Okay, the road to revolution. Basically, if you go by standard of living, people had a good life in the colonies except for enslaved people. Most of the colonies were self-governing to some extent. One thing to also keep in mind that's important as we go through the Constitution is to understand that each state or colony saw itself as unique and different from the others. There wasn't really a whole lot holding them together. There was no national or colony-wide government, and they'd been colonized by different groups of people. Granted, they all came from England for the most part, except for the Dutch, but they come for different reasons. Yes, many of them came to escape religious persecution, but that didn't mean that they felt that they didn't stop them from persecuting other religions once they got here. And there were different religions. In the Northeast, the New England states, those were people who were, the Puritans from England who escaped persecution of Puritans. Well, Maryland was Catholics escaping persecution. Later, the Puritans came into power in England, and some other people came over to get away from them. In the southern colonies, especially Virginia, that was kind of the first one. These were people who came over were not poor people. These were often the second and third, fourth, fifth sons of noble people back in England. And they came to kind of make their fortune. They weren't escaping anything. So for property owners, white people, it was a good life in the colonies. I mean, I hate that they put just except for enslaved people. That was 20% of the population. Okay, irritants. There had been a war between France and England globally. In the Americas, it was called the French and Indian War. Well, England won, but they had a lot of expenses. So they saw the colonies as a way to make revenue for the government to pay off those taxes. And the people here kind of were like, we're not really getting a benefit. Yes, Britain won a lot of land, but we don't see any benefit to ourselves. Enforcement of trade regulations. The trade system was crazy. For instance, if you were a farmer in South Carolina and you were growing rice. And the people in New York wanted rice. You could not ship directly to New York. You had to sell to a merchant based in London who would buy your stuff, ship it to London, and then another buyer would pick it up and take it to New York. So they really were on both sides. They were paying more than, they were getting less than they should and paying more than they should. There was no representation in Parliament. Parliament had a long history in England. We didn't have any representatives. Not too sure how many we would have had if we had it, but so long before the actual revolution in September 74, a couple of years really, this was the first time a group got together representing all the colonies. It was the first Continental Congress. This gives you an idea of what Britain won after the French and Indian War. So you see all these little red dots? Those were French. After the war, it was split between the Spanish and Britain. But Britain wasn't planning on sending colonists, or at least allowing the colonists from the 13 to go and settle these new lands. Some of it was going to be for Native Americans. Some were going to be new colonies sent by Britain as economic investments. Okay. So first, they were trying to like, hey, can we sort out these issues? And then they started to think, maybe we should just break away. And in 1775, Thomas Paine wrote this pamphlet called Common Sense, and it took off like wildfire. And he advocated for the American colonies to declare independence from Great Britain. Said the British monarchy and parliament was tyrannical and unfit to rule the colonies. Advocated a democratic republic, and it was written in plain language to appeal to common people. A lot of the writers at this time were very flowery in their language. This was written in plain language, lots of biblical references, and it took off like wildfire. So there's a lot of sentiment because of Thomas Paine to declare independence. Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence. He justified the revolution based on the treatment of colonies, personal rights, those like all men are endowed by their creator, and the audience meant for fellow colonists to unite them, British citizens, to try to get them to realize, that they should not support a war against the American colonies, and particularly foreign potential allies like France, who was still pissed about, the last war, and try to get them on board to send aid. And it's interesting because there were so many versions of the Declaration of Independence before Thomas Jefferson came up with his final draft. And a lot of changes of languages, and you wonder what sort of debates were going on. The phrase endowed by their creator was the final version. It was at one point endowed by God, endowed by nature, all sorts of variations, which kind of shows some difference going on as to where people stood on religion at the time as well. Creator was sort of a neutral term that he chose. Not nature, not God, just what creator, whoever that was. A lot of the people who were part of the Declaration of Independence, some of them had very strong religious values, some had less, and there was a religious movement. I wouldn't call it a religious, I would call it a non-religious movement at the time, where a lot of people just believed that God created the universe and was sort of absent now. They were called deists. Okay, so they went to Philadelphia, signed the Declaration of Independence. And also, you need to understand that England was a little bit different than other parts of Europe in that it did sort of have some democratic and anti-monarch sentiment already there. And, they had thrown over the king at one point, brought in a Republican government, decided they didn't like that person, brought back the monarch's son. They had always believed, or since King John, they'd always had restrictions on the power of the king, and Parliament was, increasing in power and prominence, especially as, like London and the other towns became powerful, less of the nobility. And so this was already growing. There was an important philosopher called John Locke. And now he was British, he died in 1704, and he really wrote about natural rights, life, liberty, and property, and that the purpose of government was to protect those things. He made a lot of assumptions about how governments were formed at the beginning of history, maybe true, maybe not true. But it involved that the power of the government came from the people to protect the people and their property. That was the whole purpose of government, and it should be limited. If you look at some of the language in the Declaration of Independence and Locke's writing, it's very similar. The state of nature has a law to government. Law is in nature, nature's God, sort of those things. Life, liberty, and property. In the Declaration of Independence, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. What was the purpose of government? What was equality? The consent of the government, of the governed. Limited government, right to revolt. So all of these ideas had already been generating and going around a couple of generations before they were adopted by the American Revolution. Now, there's a lot of debate whether the Declaration of Independence was radical or conservative. It did advocate individualism ruled by the people, said they had new ideas incubated in a unique environment. Winning independence was not easy. And was this a conservative revolution or a liberal revolution? And we'll get into that more in a minute. So, first government was formed was the Articles of Confederation. So these is before the Constitution. And there were some changes in the states, but most power was still held by the individual states. The people from the individual states still saw themselves more as Virginian than an American. There was a lot of economic turmoil. They tried to get together to, amend that Constitution in Annapolis, and it just failed because not enough states were represented. One of the big downfalls of the Articles of Confederation, was that it required unanimous approval for any amendments. A lot going on in the states. There was a lot of economic turmoil because, really wasn't a nation yet. It was really a bunch of states, a bunch of mini nations. And sometimes they would have trade wars with each other, tariffs against each other. The contract entered in one might not be recognized by another one, all sorts of things. It was more of a league of friendship among states. So the states really had the power. There was a unicameral legislature, meaning one house. There wasn't House of Representatives and Senate, there was just one. There was no president, no executive branch, no judiciary, no power to tax, no power to regulate government. It was more like the United Nations. They could make a lot of pronouncements, but they didn't have a lot of power. And one reason was that people feared strong central government. Not just, they'd had the bad example of tyranny of the British, and they still didn't really trust each other. And that went for the state governments and the people. They were still seeing themselves as a citizen of their state, not a citizen of America. The term Americans was coined by Benjamin Franklin. It wasn't around all that long. Okay, so central government weak, no executive, one chamber, and every state had one vote. Didn't matter the size, every state had one vote. There were no courts, there was no regulation of commerce, no power of direct taxation, required unanimous consent for an amendment, could raise money to maintain an army and navy. And this was only meant for like in times of war. No power over the states. Now, there were in the states themselves, there were some people who were like, hey, we're going to take all these ideas that they were talking about, and we really believe in them. So we really believe in liberty and democracy if you're a white man. A new middle class developed of artisans, farmers, and this challenged the power of the bankers, the lawyers, those kinds of people, and merchants, and most government power in legislatures. So this kind of shows you sort of the political involvement. You know how we talked about that in chapter 1? Well, if you look up here, there was a lot of involvement of the wealthy pre-war, but they really came in power in the northern states post-war. Farmers and the southern states. And there was an economic depression. A lot of that had to do with it was harder to get Britain to buy stuff like they had been before. Banks were foreclosing. There was a rebellion in 1786 where the farmers attacked the courthouses to prevent foreclosures. So this upset the bankers because they wanted, to get paid. And would this happen? No level of government could respond. The bankers and the elite hired private armies to put down the rebellion. This is good for nobody. This is kind of what they mean by failed state. Oh, and this is a lovely picture. You see people were like going crazy. First, they start to set up a meeting in Annapolis. Only 5 states showed up. So then they decided to call a new constitutional convention, try to get more states involved. We'll come back for the next part in part 2.